that we're going to be recorded. And if you can have your mic turned off, unless you want to jump in with a comment or question, which I very much hope you will, that would be great, because when I hear background noise, it can definitely throw me off. Okay, so good evening. Good to see all of you from near and far for this course that I called, wait, let me let someone else in. I think something like the Weird and Wonderful World of Midrash, believe it or not. I'm old enough to remember the Ripley's, believe it or not, places around the world. I don't know if they even still exist. I think there was one at Fisherman's Wharf in San Francisco, if I remember. But I want to just say that Midrash is a very interesting genre within Judaism and within Jewish letters, Jewish literature. I taught a course on Midrash, I think 3 years ago, maybe, but this one is going to be a little bit different, and not all of you were able to get that. I wanted to just let you know that Midrash is a genre that really started about 1,500 years ago. And it started around the 2nd century of the Common Era, and it went on from then until about the 12th century, which was the peak. So there was almost a 1,000-year period in there where a whole bunch of different books were written that contained midrashim, the plural of midrash. You're going to see some of them tonight and then next Wednesday. There are midrashim in the Talmud itself. And then there were books that actually had names that were specifically books of midrash. A famous one was called the Mechilta. That was a midrash on the book of Exodus. Midrash Rabbah, which means the great midrash. That was a book of midrashim that covered the entire Hebrew Bible. The Zohar, the book of Jewish mysticism, in many ways itself is a work of midrash. And midrash, excuse me, is a kind of creative attempt by rabbis and others to fill in gaps, to explain inconsistencies, to make sense of repetitions, to understand the inner thoughts and feelings of biblical characters. I think, as some of you know who've studied with me, the Torah is often very sparse. We don't learn a lot about the inner lives of the characters in the Hebrew Bible. You know, when Moses dies, he climbs up Mount Nebo and disappears without a word. We have no idea what's going on inside of him. Or Abraham and Sarah, when they're told by God that they have to kill their son Isaac. We don't have any idea what they're thinking or feeling. So midrashim look at episodes like that and try to imagine what might have been going through the head of Moses or Abraham or Sarah. Or if a word is repeated, they don't think anything in the Torah was superfluous. So they'll try to ask themselves, for example, when Abraham is about to kill his son Isaac with a knife over his throat, an angel calls out, Avraham, Avraham, Abraham, Abraham. And the author of a midrash says, well, why twice? Why did the angel need to say Abraham's name twice? And there are elaborate midrashim about why the angel called out his name twice. Or, as I said, when Moses goes up to die at the end of the book of Deuteronomy, in the book itself, to paraphrase Dylan Thomas, he does seem to go gently into that good night. But there are a whole collection of midrashim that suggest just the opposite. And there's a very famous one where Moses dies kicking and screaming, and he rages against the dying of the light. Now, there's no evidence at all in the Torah that he did that, but whoever wrote this midrash tried to put himself in Moses's brain and said, well, this isn't right. I mean, there were probably a million emotions going on, a million thoughts going on in Moses when God tells him he has to die after dedicating his life for 40 years to the Jewish people. And it goes on and on and on. And I think sometimes a midrash tells us far more about the author than it does about Torah. And we're going to look at some that do that. But tonight in particular, I wanted to look at some that were pretty wacky, pretty wild. Some of them were responses to verses or scenes from the Torah, and some were just sort of stories and aphorisms that had nothing at all to do with the Torah. And hopefully you'll find them interesting. You may find them hard to believe, and you may find them a little weird or wonderful. And that's why I called this seminar, believe it or not, the weird and wonderful world of Midrash. So I'm going to share my screen with you right now. And as I said, if you have a question or a comment, either raise your hand or just unmute yourself and then ask away. But let me first just put this on the screen. Okay, so you can all see this on your screen. And I'm going to go ahead and read the very first one. This one is from the Palestinian Talmud. So again, we're going back about 1,500 years. And some of you may know that there were two Talmuds that were written. There was the Talmud that was written in Palestine, the Palestinian Talmud, and then there was the Babylonian Talmud, written in Babylonia, modern-day Iraq. And that was the one that tended to dominate up until this day. But there are a lot of stories that are shared by both of them. It's a much longer conversation that I'm not going to get into right now. But let me go ahead and read this first one. A certain man, and you can follow along, invited a sage to his home and seated a dog next to him. When the sage asked his host, "Do I deserve such humiliation from you?" The host replied, "Master, I owe the dog much gratitude. Slavers came into the city, and when one of them sought to rape my wife, the dog saved her by springing on him and biting off his testicles." So some of these midrashim are actually kind of funny. Some of them are kind of weird. And there's actually quite a bit going on in this first one that I want to share. First of all, this midrash comes from the Talmud itself. It's not from one of the books that are dedicated to a collection of midrashim. So we have this story. We have this episode that is recounted in the Talmud about a man, just, a simple man in a town who invites a sage. He invites a rabbi, some big shot, some intellectual to sit in his home. And then he puts a dog next to him. And then the sage is kind of mortified. He said, are you trying to humiliate me? Why are you putting this dirty animal next to me? That would seem to suggest that in that time, dogs were not looked at favorably. And there are, in fact, quite a lot of references to dogs in Jewish literature that are not that favorable. Although this is going to go in a different direction. And those of you who know me and know how much I love my dog and other dogs know why I wanted to start with this one. So the rabbi thinks he's trying to humiliate him. And he says to this man, why are you putting a dog next to me? Why are you denigrating me? And then this guy says, you're actually wrong. You're misinterpreting me. This dog, when slavers came in, and that indicates to us that at this time, at least, and we know from the Babylonian exile, we know from the Roman conquest, we know that people did come into Israel and enslave people and send them into exile. So he's saying, people came in to the city, they were going to enslave others. One of them wanted to rape my wife. And this dog, who you think I'm humiliating you with, sprung on this guy and bit off his testicles. So it's kind of funny, but it's also kind of profound, because what he's saying, it's sort of a bait and switch. The rabbi thinks he's putting a dog next to him to embarrass him. And in fact, he's putting this dog next to him to honor him, because this dog saved his wife's honor, might have saved her life. And by placing this dog next to this man, he's trying to honor him. And it's not what we would expect. So I find that, honestly, to be a little bit of a weird midrash, and one that goes in a totally different direction that we think it might have gone in. And again, this is from 1,500 years ago, and it's from the Talmud itself. Any thoughts about this? Any comments? And I can't really see your hands now because I'm sharing the screen. So just unmute yourself and just say your name if you want to add anything to this. Otherwise, I'll just go on. Okay, let's look at the next one. So here we have a passage from the Babylonian Talmud. The first one was the Palestinian. This is the Babylonian Talmud. And this also tells a story. It's not necessarily a riff on a biblical verse. So it's attributed to a rabbi, Rabbi Muna bar Tota. Bar means son, like Ben. And this man says, once I went to a place where crossbreeding was practiced, and I saw a snake wrapped around a lizard. This is kind of weird also. After some days, an arod, we don't really know what an arod is, emerged from between them. When I came with this story before Rabbi Shimon the Pious, he said to me, the Holy One declares, these people have been bringing into being creatures that I did not create in my world. I too will bring upon them a vastly more dangerous creature that I did not create in my world. So this one is interesting to me in a couple of respects. First of all, it's weird. You know, it's a story of someone who stumbles upon someone else who's crossbreeding animals, and the two animals he's crossbreeding are a snake and a lizard. So he sees a snake and a lizard copulating with each other. And then after a few days, I mean, that's weird in and of itself. After a couple of days, it gives birth, but this thing called an arod emerges. All we know is an arod is this, product of a snake and a lizard. And then he recounts this story to a very pious rabbi, Shimon HaChassid, and he's very upset with it. And he says that God declares, how dare you do this? How dare you play God and bring into the world creatures that I did not create? I've created humans, I've created dogs, I've created snakes, I've created fish, but I did not create this thing in our road. That's the result of crossbreeding. It's almost like Frankenstein's monster. And then God says in a very ominous way, if you're going to do this, if you're going to play God, which in some ways is idolatry, this is avodah zarah, this is idol worship. By crossbreeding these two animals, this man was playing God, and God is incensed. Idolatry is a capital crime in Judaism, and God says, if you're going to do this, I'm going to bring about an even a dangerous creature that is going to pose a real threat to you that I did not create in my world. So I think of the Frankenstein story, Frankenstein's monster. He creates life, he plays God, and it ends very, very badly for him. Or I think of the movie Jurassic Park. I mean, raise your hand if you've seen Jurassic Park. I think most of us have seen that. They do the same thing. The guy who runs Jurassic Park, uses mosquitoes that have elephant blood that were trapped in amber. And as a result, we know that all hell breaks loose on that island. So this, to my mind, and then Lauren, I know you have a question. To my mind, this particular midrash, and again, it tells us more about the rabbi who wrote it than anything else. This particular midrash is sort of a cautionary tale. The way Mary Shelley's story is a cautionary tale. The way that in Greek mythology, the story of Prometheus bringing fire to the world is kind of a cautionary tale because he's punished for that. And here we have, this strange story of crossbreeding, and they give birth to this strange animal that's a product of a snake and a lizard, and God is very, very angry because they have committed a capital crime of idolatry. So I think it's a pretty weird story. Lauren, you had a question or a comment? You can go ahead and unmute yourself.
Yeah, I unmute. I actually was just raising your hand when you said raise your hand because I can't see the gallery. But while I'm on the subject, it is just obviously pre-scientific people. I don't know. It is definitely weird. That's all. I didn't really mean to raise my hand to ask a question.
Well, I hope it's weird and wonderful. That was the point of the discussion that that I picked. Does anyone have any thoughts about this? I mean, here's an example of a midrash not trying to answer a question. For example, what was Moses thinking when God told him he was going to die and never make it into the promised land? Or what was Abraham thinking when God told him he was going to have to kill his son Isaac? You know, this is not really answering a question. This one is just offering a cautionary tale of something that does not appear in Scripture. There's no episode like this in the Hebrew Bible. This author made it up, and he made it up to teach us something. To teach us.
Are you sure about that? It might just have been a random entry in his diary.
You know, I don't know, but my guess is because this is a literary genre.
I guess
just like anyone who writes a novel, you know, has something they want to teach us. Shakespeare had a lot he wanted to teach us through his plays. Here we have a midrash in the Talmud that seems to be a cautionary tale, warning us, you know, using the example of crossbreeding, but basically saying, don't play God. You know, don't mess with things that you don't understand.
Why is this doing it?
It's interesting. I'm sorry.
Fred, did you have a comment? Go ahead.
Yeah, I did. It's interesting that the punishment for crossbreeding is for God to do essentially what they did, but in an exaggerated way. I'm going to show you that if you do this, I'm going to do this times 10 to you and really show you why you didn't do it. So the punishment in a way is fitting the crime here.
Yeah, I think that's right. Any other thoughts on this midrash? Either the purpose of it or the midrash itself? Okay, let's look at another weird one. And this one I had heard about a long time ago, but I have to give a shout out to Lauren Kaplan, who reminded me of it and gave me a great link to start my research on it. This is also from the Babylonian Talmud, and it has to do with mermaids or mermans. If you think Judaism doesn't believe in really weird stuff, you know, look at Midrash. So we have been reading in this month's Torah portion about the building of the Tabernacle, the Mishkan, and all of the different furnishings within it. And it talks about gold and silver and animal skins and leather and wood. And one of the animals that is referenced is called a techash. Techashim is plural. And we don't know exactly what that was. Some people translate it as dolphins, but we don't know exactly what techashim were. So in the Babylonian Talmud, when it's talking about, you know, this scene, it says dolphins are fruitful and reproduce like human beings. The Gemara asks, what are dolphins? And Rabbi Judah says, they are creatures that are called sons of the sea. So in Hebrew, it's B'nai Yam. B'nai Yam is children of the sea. So the Talmud asks a question, you know, what are these things? Techashim, we don't know exactly what they are. And now Rashi, who's a commentator from France in the 13th century, I think some of you have studied Rashi with me before, and he was a vintner, which is significant for us here in Napa Valley. He offers commentary on the Talmud, throughout the Talmud. So he comments on the Talmud and why it says they are called B'nai Yam, children of the sea. So Rashi says the line should be read not that dolphins are fruitful and reproduce like human beings. The Hebrew is ki b'nei Adam, but we should read it, dolphins are fruitful and reproduce from human beings. And then he says, when human beings mate with dolphins, they become pregnant. Then they can produce creatures in the sea, which have half human form and half fish form. So Rashi seems to be saying here that we should understand that line, not as dolphins reproduce like we do, but that dolphins and humans can actually have sex with each other and reproduce. And he says that when this happens, dolphins can become pregnant. Sometimes they can produce other dolphins, but they also have the potential to produce creatures in the sea. that are half human and half fish. And, what is a half human and a half fish? Most of us think of mermaids or mermen. And to me, that's a pretty weird midrash to think that in the Talmud, and Rashi wrote, as I said, in the 13th century, that, some rabbis, still believed in mermaids, or at least he felt that in antiquity, that is what they had in mind. I don't know if someone can help me. I wish that I could share my screen and also see all of you, but
I'm trying to do that too.
Yeah, for some reason, I can't really do that
My
well.
iPad is confusing.
Lauren, did you have a question?
Yeah, I did. There's the Midrash that started out this thing, and then there's Rashi, and then there's this other one, Tanhuma. Are these the Midrash, and then a comment to the Midrash, and then a comment to the comment? Is that what's going on here?
They're all a little bit different. When you have Talmud,
do they refer to one another?
I know, Lauren, can you just mute yourself for a second?
Yeah.
Thank you. If you have Talmud, the Talmud is usually the foundation text, and then you have a commentary on it. So what we've read up to now have been passages from the Talmud, and here Rashi comments on it. What we're going to get to next is a standalone midrash from a book called the Tanhuma, which is not the Talmud at all, but a standalone book. Like I don't know what's a book. An atlas or something. It's its own genre. But everything up to now has been Talmud and commentaries on the Talmud. Other comments or questions? Okay, let's go on now to Tanhuma, which, as I said, is sort of a standalone. And the way Tanhuma is structured, it offers midrashim based on different Torah portions in the Bible. And this Torah portion is Vayeshev, which comes from the book of Genesis. So here the author says, there are creatures that grow in fire but cannot grow in air. And I don't remember, I don't have it in front of me, but Vayeshev may have touched on fire, it may have touched on air, it may have touched on animals, but it doesn't take much for these rabbis to go off and running and offer these different midrashim. So he says there are creatures that grow in fire but cannot grow in air. What is one? The salamander. We know that salamanders are real animals. They're in the lizard family. How does it come into being? That's his question. And now look at his weird answer. When makers of glass heat their furnace 7 successive days and 7 successive nights, there emerges from the fierceness of the fire a creature resembling a mouse, which people call salamander. If a man applies its blood to his hand or to any of his limbs, fire has no power over that spot. Why not? Because the salamander's origin is from fire. So this is a pretty weird midrash as well. He's talking about the salamander, and in other cultural traditions, the salamander is viewed as being impervious from fire. Here it says he's actually born in fire, and I read about it a little bit, and a lot of cultures say this because I guess what would happen is when fires burned out and there would be charred wood that was left behind and other kinds of organic material, the next day or what have you, salamanders would get in there and then climb out, and it looked like they were coming from the fire rather than just going to the fire or the embers after the fires had gone out. So he's saying, that if someone is a glassmaker, if they keep their furnace on for 7 days and nights, it's very specific, suddenly there emerges from that fire something that looks like a mouse. Don't ask me why he said it looks like a mouse. I mean, I looked at pictures of salamanders. They do not look like mice. And he says, that's a salamander. And if someone puts the blood of a salamander on their hand or on any part of their body, they become impervious to fire also, because the salamander comes from fire. And if you put some of its blood on yourself, then you'll be impervious to fire. So again, it's a weird story. I mean, the first two we looked at were not supernatural at all. There have been a lot of stories of dogs protecting their owners, of dogs doing heroic things. Even crossbreeding is not a supernatural midrash. There's crossbreeding that goes on today. The American Kennel Club has a long list of different breeds of dogs that are the result of crossbreeding that's been going on for many centuries. But it's only when it starts getting to the one before and then this one where you're talking about mermaids or you're talking about salamanders and putting blood on your body that it starts moving from something that is weird but natural to something that is weird and supernatural. So there was a notion of the supernatural, at least among some people who wrote these various midrashim. Supernaturalism, as I've often said, is not a predominant idea in Judaism, but even in the Torah, there's an acknowledgement that it exists. So the Torah may say, don't consult with the sorceress, or don't consort with the dead. But by saying you should not mess with that kind of stuff, it actually acknowledges that kind of stuff existed, at least back then. So there seems to be this tension in Judaism, even in rabbinic Judaism, which is what we're looking at now, between saying, our focus should really be on justice and mercy and ethical behavior and building community and having a good relationship with God and with each other, and not playing around with all this supernatural stuff. And yet there seems to be an acknowledgement among at least some people that it exists. There are mermaids. There are some creatures that are born in fire. And if you put blood on your body from them, you'll be protected from fire. So this kind of stuff does exist. And I think you're much more likely to find it in Midrash as a genre than in halakha, in Jewish law. So if you've ever studied Jewish law, and it's not hugely popular in the non-Orthodox community, but down the road, I'm happy to teach it if the group wants it. But halakha is pretty straightforward, and you'll almost never see anything supernatural. But when you look at Midrash, you will often get some of that. And I deliberately tonight tried to pick some midrashim that were particularly weird and a little supernatural. So any thoughts or questions at all?
Yeah, I have a
go
reaction.
ahead, Fred.
Okay, I have a reaction to this. I mean, these are supposed to be some of the great Jewish thinkers of all times. And you can clearly disprove that salamander blood does not protect you from fire by doing it. You're going to find out that it really hurts. The fire is having an effect. And so I'm wondering if these people restricted some of these thoughts merely to writing, or if they actually spoke them and taught them out loud. And if they did that, I'm just wondering what kind of group of people would actually believe this stuff.
Well, that's a good question. Not all of the rabbis in the Talmud, not all rabbis were created equal, and some were a lot smarter than others. Some tended to embrace reason and rationality, like Maimonides, and some were more immersed in fable and legend and myth. And I think we're seeing a little bit of that here. It leads to some really creative stuff. Now, whether it was taught verbally or just in this literary genre, and then Lauren, I'll get to you in a second. I don't know, but I had a professor once who grew up Orthodox, and when you study Talmud in the yeshiva, and let's go above to the one about mermaids, when you would get to, in the Talmud, it's actually called Agadah rather than Midrash, but it's pretty much the same thing. So if you were studying in the Talmud and you were reading about, the different materials that went into building of the tabernacle and why, and how many cubits it was, and, how much gold you were supposed to put in there, and all of the different legal rules. And then you came upon a passage like this about mermaids. He said his rabbis, his professors would just skip over it and be like, oh, that's just Midrash, let's skip over it. So you find in a lot of the Eastern European yeshivas, even to this day in New York and elsewhere, they'll skip over a lot of this stuff. I mean, you can get a PhD in Midrash. Midrash is taught as a genre in Jewish studies departments all over the world. And there's some really interesting, fascinating midrashim that you can look at, some that are weird, some that defy logic. I can think of a lot of fiction that defies logic as well, that is beautiful and insightful. All you have to do is think of magical realism. And, Gabriel what's his name? And Marquez, Gabriel Garcia Marquez, or anyway, it's Central American and South American literature. Magical realism has a lot of legend and fable and, supernatural stuff in it. So just because it's supernatural and bizarre doesn't mean it may not have something to teach us. For example, the crossbreeding midrash has something to teach us about the dangers of putting ourselves in the role of God. So I don't know if this is about intellect. I think it's more just about agenda. What is this author trying to convey to us and why? So I don't know if that helps, Fred, but a lot of this stuff, as I said, in academia is studied outright as its own subject. But in the yeshivas to this day, a lot of it gets skipped over for precisely the reason you're saying, that, oh, this is weird. It's not rational. It's just kind of a story. That's not how we want to spend our time when we're studying Talmud. Lauren, you had a comment or a question? Lauren, I think you need to unmute yourself.
Oh, unmute. Okay. But what you just said, I'm also getting the impression that things are in the Talmud so that we will pay attention, as metaphorical or as weird as it is, that we draw meanings from them. But I was going to mention, when I was in Israel, I think it was Sfat, I found this little pamphlet in a bookstore, and it was Maimonides, who apparently was a doctor, or he was putting himself out as a doctor, and it had all of these cures and stuff in there, and they were completely outlandish, and very magical. Putting the poultices on and doing this and doing that, and incantations into the night, and I'll show it to you at some point. But I kind of wonder if the comment that the Midrash speaks to that sort of that pre-scientific way that people were trying to understand the world and the physical world, and what affected what, and if and there was this magic that permeated the way people try to understand the universe, and is this some kind of response to that, or incorporation, or this is just how they thought back in those days, that there was this sort of magic that occurred, sort of pre-logical kind of thinking, pre-scientific thinking.
Yeah, well, I think it was, Maimonides was a physician. I don't know what kind of medical training he got in Spain and Morocco and Egypt in the 12th century, but he was a physician. And I'm not familiar with the pamphlet you're talking about, but it's unusual to me because he was very direct in his writing. I don't have one in front of me, but some of you may know that hand against the evil eye from North Africa and the Middle East. And there were a lot of amulets in Judaism at this time. Magical amulets. People treated mezuzahs in some way as magical to kind of, hold on, I need to mute someone. They created amulets. They would treat mezuzahs as protecting them from evil rather than as statements of identity or an embrace of monotheism. And Maimonides was very clear in his writing and that he was very much opposed to that. I don't know if he wrote that when he was in Morocco or in Spain, but in his writings, he comes down, he's a real rationalist, and he comes down very hard on his fellow Jews who practice, who I don't know about practice magic, but believe in magic, have these amulets. I remember when I was in Central Asia in 1993, I was staying with the Bucharan Jewish community in Uzbekistan, and I was in the town of Samarkand. We all know about Sephardic Jews. We know about Ashkenazic Jews. A lot of people don't know about Bukharan Jews. There are lots of other different types of Jews, and the Bukharan Jews trace their ancestry to the Babylonian exile. And they think that they wound up in Central Asia, going through Israel and Turkey and the Caucasus and, in that area from a very long time ago. And they have their own unique traditions that I saw, and I've written about them in the past. But one thing that I saw when I was there, and I got into a little bit of trouble with the authorities because I was there illegally. But whenever I would leave the house of the guy I was staying with, he was a photographer, and he wasn't the most sophisticated person in the world, but he was very devout. He would not let me leave their house unless I kissed the mezuzah. And he would not let me enter the house unless I kissed the mezuzah. And it became even more acute when I got into trouble with the local authorities. And it was almost like he felt that by kissing the mezuzah, it's like that blood. I'm sorry, this may be a bad analogy, like the blood of the salamander protecting someone from fire. It's almost like he thought if I kissed the mezuzah, I would somehow magically be protected from the KGB, who wound up interviewing me and asking why I was in that country without a documentation. So Maimonides was very much opposed to that. And he said, mezuzahs are great, but mezuzahs are statements of belief. The letter on a mezuzah is shin for Shaddai. It's a name of God. And the parchment inside is from the Ve'ahavta. You shall love the Lord your God with all your mind, with all your heart, with all your being. It has nothing to do with magic. It's a statement of identity, that we're Jews. We love God and we pursue justice. We're going to teach these words to our children, and we believe in monotheism. That's what a mezuzah is about. A mezuzah is not about protecting, some 27-year-old rabbinical student from the KGB, So, Lauren, to your point, I don't know about that pamphlet you're talking about, but generally speaking, Maimonides was very opposed to anything that smacked of supernaturalism. So maybe you can show it to me the next time you see me.
I will, and while we're talking about it's also quite possible, but that this was a completely made up pamphlet by somebody else who wanted to sell, pamphlets and make money in spot.
I would be very dubious about some of that stuff.
I'm going to pull it out and see what it is.
Okay. Any other comments or thoughts before we move on to one more? Okay, let's go ahead. I have figured out how to minimize this thing. Are you seeing the gallery on your screen that I'm opening and closing? I don't think you are. All you see is my page, correct?
No, I can see the gallery too.
Oh, you can. Okay. Well, let me close
the thing in the upper right, Niles, that if you click it, you can get the gallery to overlay your page as well.
Yeah, no, I got that. Thank you.
Okay.
All right, let's look at this last one here. This is also from the Babylonian Talmud. It's a little bit longer, so I'll break it up in the middle. It says, Rabbi Judah said in the name of Rav, and Baba Batra is an Aramaic phrase. It means the middle gate. And the middle gate is just one of the tractates in the Talmud. But my guess is that there was some reference to Leviathan and Behemoth in that tractate, and that's why it led to this weird stream of consciousness midrash that we're about to read. So it says, Rabbi Judah said in the name of Rav, these were two very well-known rabbis, all that the Holy One created in the world, God created male and female. That seems pretty obvious. We know that from the book of Genesis. We know that from the story of Noah and the flood. at least for, Jews who lived 1500 years ago, it makes sense that any living thing probably has a male and a female counterpart. So it says, all that the Holy One created in the world, God created male and female. So too, Leviathan, the bolt straight serpent, and Leviathan, the coiled serpent. God created male and female. Now, Leviathan, as well as Behemoth, which we'll read about in a minute, was this kind of mythical monster. Leviathan was a sea monster. Behemoth was a land monster. And they appear in the book of Job. They appear in the book of Psalms. And there are these strange mythical creatures that, we have no evidence for. Some people thought maybe they referred to dinosaurs, that were in their memories or handed down by oral tradition. But there are these mythical monsters. Most religious traditions have these mythical monsters in them. What he seems to be saying here is that when God created Leviathan, and there's no evidence for this to the best of my knowledge in the Bible itself. In the Bible, it only says Leviathan and Behemoth. It doesn't say whether it's male or female. But he's saying there are two of them. There's the male Leviathan who is straight, and then there's the female Leviathan who's coiled. And then he says, if they had mated with each other, their numerous progeny, all of their offspring, would have destroyed the entire world, all of it. So what does that mean? I mean, here are these huge mythical monsters. Leviathan wraps around the entire world. If they gave birth to other huge giant sea monsters, they would have overwhelmed the entire planet. So what does God do? And again, it's a midrash. It's trying to answer a problem. So the problem is this author cannot conceive of a living thing that it does not have a male and female counterpart. So he's wondering, oh my God, if there was a male and female sea serpent, sea monster, how did God prevent them from mating with each other and, overwhelming the world? It's like having humans live during the same time as dinosaurs. It just couldn't happen. So then he offers a midrash to solve the problem. What did the Holy One do? God castrated the male and killed the female, preserving her in brine for the righteous in the world to come. So I told you, these are some weird stories. And this one is interesting to me because it has to do with this male and female thing, but also God plays a role in this. And it depicts God basically, producing a male and female sea serpent and then ultimately castrating the male so they can't mate with each other, and then killing the female and putting her in brine. Now, some of you may know that one vision of the afterlife, of the world to come in Judaism, and I wrote about this in the last chapter of my last book, 8 Questions of Faith, that vision of the world to come involves a bunch of people, the righteous of the world, sitting on a table, studying and debating with each other under the skin of the Leviathan and eating the meat of Behemoth. This is sort of a riff on it. And instead of sitting under the skin of the Leviathan, the female is preserved in brine. They understood how to preserve fish. And they and that meat, that fish, was set aside until the afterlife, the world to come. Now, I don't know if we have any New Yorkers here. I know Carol lived in New York when I lived in New York. Does anyone know that appetizing place called Russ and Daughters?
Yeah.
You can order from Russ and Daughters. I just ordered, I'll be honest with you, $200 worth of herring the other day because I read an article about herring. I got a craving for it. And I said, why not? Life is short. But herring is preserved in brine. It's also preserved in a lot of other things. And one tradition in Judaism is to eat herring or other preserved fish on the Sabbath, on Shabbat. I've been to lots of synagogues where after services on Saturday morning, more traditional ones, afterwards you'll eat herring and you'll drink some vodka. I don't know if any of you there have ever experienced that, but it's a lot of fun. But what people don't realize is that that goes back not specifically to this midrash, but to a tradition a lot of people are not even aware of. This idea that on the Sabbath, and the Sabbath is supposed to represent a foretaste of the world to come. Some of you may have heard that before, but in rabbinic literature, the rabbis talk about Shabbat as being a taste of the world to come. And so there's this tradition of eating pickled fish to literally give us a taste of what life is going to be like in the world to come. And this is a midrash where we see that. But what it represents is a triumph of order over chaos. What it represents is God basically taking control of these two mythical, monstrous sea serpents and making sure that they're not going to be able to reproduce. And so when we eat pickled fish on Shabbat, again, I promise you this was going to be weird and kind of strange. When we eat pickled fish on Shabbat, we are, whether we know it or not, celebrating the victory of order over chaos, celebrating the triumph of God over the forces of anarchy and destructiveness, and really giving ourselves a taste of what Olam Haba, what the world to come is going to look like. It's very strange. So let me read the second part of this midrash, where he moves from talking about Leviathan to Behemoth. And then it says, also with regard to Behemoth, in Hebrew it's Behemoth. A lot of us have heard that word Behemoth, which means it's a big land animal. So it's sort of a land parallel to Leviathan. And it says, so too with Behemoth, which daily eats up the grass of 1,000 hills. God created male and female. And if they had mated with each other, their numerous progeny would have destroyed the entire world, all of it. So what did the Holy One do? God castrated the male and froze the female, preserving her for the righteous in the time to come. So there are some similarities in that God castrates the male to prevent them from mating with each other, and then preserves the female by freezing her. So even back then they understood, you needed to keep meat cold. It's not preserving it in salt, in brine like fish. They didn't have refrigeration back then, but obviously they understood that if you're going to kill a giant cow, a giant land monster, you need to freeze the thing. So here it's a very similar thing. Instead of freezing the Leviathan, the sea serpent, in brine, you're freezing the female behemoth so that we can eat of that flesh in the world to come. And I mentioned to you earlier that that's one of the rabbinic visions of the afterlife, that we'll be sitting under the skin of Leviathan, having this great feast of the meat of behemoth. And it says earlier that this thing is so big, it eats the grass of 1,000 hills. We have a bunch of cows here in Napa and in Sonoma, and we know that all day long they're eating grass. Well, if you have, a cow that's 1,000 times as big, it's going to eat 1,000 times as much. So the rabbis, again, are trying to deal with this problem. If these two mythical giant creatures mate with each other, they're going to eat all the grass, all the vegetation of the world. So God steps in again and castrates the male and freezes the female. So this particular midrash, again, is very bizarre. It's one that most of us, certainly in the Reform movement, would never know anything about. It would be easy to dismiss it as primitive or strange, but a lot of our customs come from this. And I'll give you another custom going back to Leviathan. I mentioned the custom of eating pickled fish or herring on Shabbat. That comes from this idea. Another one is eating a head of a fish on Shabbat. Now, when I was in Israel for my first time, or maybe it was my second time, I think it was my first time in the late 80s, I had a Shabbat dinner with a guy I became friendly with who was Yemenite. His parents were from Yemen, and he lived in a town called Beit Shean. It was a development town. It was pretty poor. They didn't have much. There was a lot of discrimination back then. There still is in Israel, but it was worse back then between the, Eastern European Jews and some of these Jews who had come over from Yemen and elsewhere. And anyway, on Friday night, they served me a wonderful Shabbat dinner. I was their guest. And then they put a plate in front of me. They were all eating other stuff, that looked really good to me. And they put a big head of a fish on my plate. And I had no idea what to do with this thing. I didn't know how to eat it. It was a huge head of a fish. I don't know if it was a carp or something else. And I was picking at it. I was starving and I could barely find any meat in it. I just didn't know. I didn't want to eat the eyes, the lips, I didn't have any idea what to do with this. But I learned after the fact, it's a different custom. This is more of a North African, Middle Eastern custom. It's not eating pickled fish on Shabbat. It's eating a fish head on Shabbat, but it represents the same kind of idea. It is meant to represent the triumph of order over chaos, the victory of God over the forces of darkness. And the fish head is supposed to represent Leviathan, and it's supposed to convey that idea that when we read about Leviathan and Behemoth in the book of Psalms or in the book of Job, where they're referenced as very scary, powerful beings. It's a way of showing how they're not going to destroy us. And so I think it's important to know some of these teachings that lead to these customs that, may not be as popular now as they used to be, but that I've seen myself in a couple different contexts. One was Ashkenazic and the other was Mizrahi, Middle Eastern, North African. But again, it's a pretty strange midrash. And a lot of the ones I picked for tonight, and I want to end with this, we'll end a little early, but I think, online an hour is probably enough for most of us. They just going back to the beginning, they start, with a dog playing a protective role. They go on to crossbreeding. We know crossbreeding has gone back a long way. I mean, if you crossbreed a horse with a donkey, you get a mule. So I'm sure there was a lot of different crossbreeding going on back then, but this midrash, seems to have a little bit of a dim view of it. Then we get to the one about mermaids, and then finally the one about Leviathan and Behemoth. So there are a lot of things going on. Let me stop sharing my screen now so we can see each other. Okay, that's probably better. Some of them are naturalistic. Some of them are supernatural. Some of them try to address a problem. Some of them try to get us to think of things in new ways. Let's not think of dogs as dirty, humble animals. Let's think of them as heroic, and noble creatures. Let's try to offer a cautionary tale about playing God. So there are a lot of different purposes to them. I think next week, I'm not going to focus so much on animals and these mythical creatures. I want to do some more that are more about addressing problems, but about doing them in sort of unusual, sometimes bizarre ways. So I haven't heard a lot of comments or questions tonight, but I hope that you found these midrashim to be interesting, even if they might have seemed a little, quote unquote, primitive. Any final thoughts or comments about any of these? David, I see you there. I'm just curious, as someone who grew up in Morocco, did you see any customs around Shabbat that were similar, that involved fish on Shabbat?
No, actually, no. I mean, I grew up in a Sephardi household, as you know. No, that's why when I was hearing you describe this, I was very surprised. The only time I saw a fish head on the table was for Rosh Hashanah. And that's when you do the prayer. Either you have, a lamb's head, Rosh Kebesh,
Right.
or if you, in the absence of a lamb's head, you get a fish head.
Yeah.
But it was interesting as you were going through the thing about the herring. I thought to myself, this is great because I love herring. So that worked for me. But I did want to bring up something that you brought up in terms of amulets, and that was the hand.
Yeah.
So in terms of Maimonides, when he arrived in Fez, he saw that the hand as an amulet, and it's still to this day in the city of Fez, which was the center of Jewish learning at that time. When he went, it was called the hand of Fatima.
Right.
That was what it was, and he saw a lot of the Jewish population had adopted it. So as you correctly pointed out, he did not care for these kinds of things at all. So among the Moroccan Jews, the hand stayed, but now came to represent the Chamishei Chumshei Torah, the 5 books of the Torah.
Oh,
So it was
I
like
didn't
the
know that.
5 book. Yeah, so the 5 books of the Torah are protecting you, not the hand of Fatima.
That's interesting. You know, it
Yeah.
reminds me a little bit of what I've learned about it's not a perfect analogy. It just reminds me a little bit. When the Spanish went into Mexico, and there were all these indigenous peoples practicing different religions that they would view as, pagan or I don't know what you would call them, but they were not Christian. They incorporated some of the gods of these indigenous populations and turned them into Catholic saints. And I can't think of any specific ones right now, but I've studied that about when the Portuguese went to Brazil, when the Spanish went to Mexico. A lot of these Christian conquerors would try to incorporate some of the religions of those places, but in a way that was palatable to both groups, and they would reinterpret them. So I had actually not heard that before about the 5 books of Moses. I like that a lot. I do still think, I'm going to stick to my guns, I do still think that Maimonides would not have been in favor of that hand serving a protective or magical role. I think he might have liked its symbolic meaning, but maybe not the amulet idea.
I'm sorry, I would agree with you. I can tell you in my own household, we had the hand, but the hand was there strictly as the 5 books of the Torah. If, with the thing of you follow the Torah, you'll be fine. That's the protection, the action phase.
Yeah.
But it was not, but he had to do something, from what I understand, obviously, from what I read, is that he had to address the fact that, if you recall, when he came to Morocco, at one point, he even converted to Islam. So he really saw a lot of the Jewish population in Morocco being Arabicized, and he viewed that as an existential threat to the community.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's why he began to write, guides for the perplexed and things like that, because he had to address the possible loss and assimilation of the Jewish population there.
Yeah, interesting. Well, thanks, David. I learned a little bit more about Moroccan Judaism. I appreciate that.
Come on over.
Any final thoughts? Yeah, Lauren?
I was just saying that the term syncretism applies to this, right? It's this kind of way that cultures encounter each other and then take, for various kinds of reasons, take on the features, but mold them into their own form. I have ancestors that come from Nova Scotia, who are the original Acadians from Nova Scotia. And when the French Catholics came, they met the indigenous chief and they found this sort of common ground in terms of basic philosophical ideas about faith and spirit. And so the people that became the early Acadians kind of shared this new culture together. And that's why the French, the Acadians and not the Miwok, I can't remember which Indian tribe it was, got along so well together in peace for such a long period of time. So it's just a very interesting way that culture develops and changes.
No, I think that happens, and maybe that's a good note to end on. I think syncretism can be problematic, but it's also unavoidable,
Right.
and I think, and I've said that it's a mistake to imagine that there was ever a Judaism that was pure and pristine and that never had any influence by any outside culture or religion. Going back to the book of Exodus, even the beginning of the Jewish society, when they're liberated from Egypt and they cross the Sea of Reeds, before the Ten Commandments occurs, before the revelation at Sinai occurs, Moses's Gentile father-in-law, who's a Midianite priest, Jethro, he basically establishes the judiciary, and that plays a fundamental role in the birth of the Israelite nation. So, we have a foreign idea, a foreign influence, baked into the Jewish DNA. David was talking about Judaism in Morocco, and we've talked about Maimonides a little bit, just because he's such a towering figure. But he was highly influenced by Islam, and he was highly influenced by Aristotle. So here you have a guy we think of as arguably the most brilliant Jewish thinker ever, maybe next to Spinoza or a few others. And this was a guy who was steeped in Aristotelian Greek philosophy and Islamic Kalam philosophy, which is the school of philosophical thought at the time. And to say, this guy's Judaism was pure and pristine and was not influenced by any other intellectual tradition is absurd. And I say that not because I'm trying to take away from Judaism. I think that's one of our strengths, that we are able to incorporate the best ideas around us and help them to improve our religion, to help them to make us better. I mean, I think anyone who innovates, anyone who is disruptive, whether it's in the for-profit world or the nonprofit world, you need to do that. And if you don't borrow best practices, if you don't borrow and utilize the best ideas that are around, I mean, look at Abraham Lincoln. I know I'm going far afield, but look at Doris Kearns Goodwin and her book, Team of Rivals. Abraham Lincoln surrounded himself with people who did not think like him, but they were important figures. They were great intellects, and that made his cabinet even stronger. So anyway, I don't want to belabor the point, but I think it's really important to incorporate the best ideas around us. It's not going to take away from our Judaism. It'll only make it stronger. And I think some of that occurs in Midrash, and some of it doesn't. But I hope that these Midrashim were as advertised. I hope they were weird and wonderful, and you had a moment where you're like, oh my God, I can't believe this. But I will pick some more next week. So we're going to meet again, same time, same link, exact same link. And I will see you then. And maybe some of you I'll see at services on Friday night. Have a great week, everyone. Take care.
Thank you, Rabbi.